listener production.
Hey, Tara Cassidy with you, and welcome to The Briefing. What if I told you that in the last few days, you've been the target of political spin? It's featured at political press conferences, the leaders' debates, even some of the funniest and most memorable moments of this year's election campaign.
Is what we call covert tactics. And they refer to a whole range of sort of cynical techniques to manage information. And a lot of the spin tactics that people refer to, and because spin has quite a dirty word, they tend to involve manipulation, obfuscation, sometimes outright lying. And they're the types of techniques that people sort of worry about.
So why do politicians use spin? Does it actually work on us? And how can we trust anything that's being said? Find out in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Helen Smith. It's Wednesday, the 16th of April.
Good morning, Tara, and to you listening, happy Wednesday. Some interesting news this morning for anyone dreaming of building their own investment portfolio. Half of all investment homes purchased in Australia are resold within 2 years. The new data from Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute found 25 to 35-year-olds are more likely to buy rental properties but then quickly sell them compared to other age groups. The main reason being instability in the market around things like interest rates and related expenses.
Yeah, and meantime, the vacancy rate for a rental has dropped slightly nationwide, meaning there's less rentals available at the moment, and that always does lead to a slight increase in rent prices when that happens. Now, other new data from CoreLogic released just this morning also says that national rent prices did rise in the last quarter. But to try and find some positives or some kind of silver lining for those struggling to find or pay for their rental, CoreLogic's Eliza Owen says things have slowed.
Which is the lowest level of annual growth in rent values since March 2021.
Yeah, and there's a few things causing that. The number of people in the average household is apparently getting bigger due to the issue around rental affordability at the moment and slowing population growth. Both impact the demand for rentals, and those things then go on to impact rental values and the growth rate. So yes, prices are still high, but calming down, which for renters will be a tiny bit of good news with hopefully a sign of what's to come.
An Australian lab is racing to make a vaccine for a life-threatening virus known as hemorrhagic fever, and also in a bid to prevent the next global pandemic, which has been dubbed Disease X. Now, Bolivian Chaper virus was kept secret until February 10, and it's spread by rodents that inflict bleeding gums, fever, and pain behind the eyes, leading to the death of 60% of its victims. But there's no need to be too alarmed. There have only been 5 outbreaks in South America since 2003, with the most recent one being in January this year, where it did kill a farmer in his 50s. But that's not the reason that we are trying to race to get this vaccine, is it, Helen?
No. So Australia is leading the charge to find a vaccine under a time crunch of 150 days, giving us until July. Now, this is to try and see us be better prepared for when we're threatened with our next potential global pandemic. So for context, the fastest vaccine ever made was one of Pfizer's early COVID-19 jabs. That took around 337 days between identification of the virus and the vaccine being approved. Now, this had global funding and all the eyes of the world. So to have this goal to make and roll out a vaccine for, Disease X is a big feat taken on by this Aussie lab.
Yeah, absolutely. The Defence Minister is sighing with relief this morning following confirmation a Russian aircraft will not be stored in Indonesia. A US military website reported that Moscow had requested for that to happen, causing a bit of ruckus in Canberra where alarm bells went off due to the prospect of Russia potentially having a long-range aircraft that close to Aussie shores. Now, our government officials got in touch with Jakarta yesterday after the reports trickled in, but our Deputy PM and Defence Minister Richard Marles says those reports are simply not true.
For the first time in a decade, there are more bots using the internet than humans. A new study from a global security provider revealed 51% of our internet traffic is currently made up by bots. So it's being put down to the rise of artificial intelligence, which cybercriminals are taking advantage of.
Now, this one really pricked my ears up because firstly, strange. What on earth are all these bots doing? We hear things about like they might be used in, good ways with AI and helping businesses get rid of mundane tasks. But then on the other side, we also sometimes hear about how they're used to like manipulate people. And there was a lot of discussion around that when the Amber Heard versus Johnny Depp trial happened, and also with the recent case with Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni.
Yeah, and that was down to the PR teams being used by supposedly Johnny Depp and Justin. So we actually interviewed Jen Robinson, who was Amber Heard's lawyer in that case that you just mentioned, and she broke down these exact issues. So if you want to listen to that ep and get a bit deeper, you can just search for From Julian Assange to Amber Heard, the Australian lawyer behind it all.
And side note, in another way that this could be used, really weird timing, but last night I literally was scrolling my social media and I came across this video where this one fellow reckons that he was looking through some political posts on different Australian news social media sites where he thinks that he saw, and he screenshot these, pro-LNP comments being put underneath multiple posts, but sometimes it was like coming from different accounts and they would post the exact same positive comment, and he's accusing basically some of the parties of using bots. And so now I am invested. I am going to go on a super sleuthing mission today to try and find these myself. If anyone has seen this type of stuff, please reach out. Send us the receipts on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. If so, I will be reaching out to the parties doing this and let's see what they have to say.
Swapping red meat for chicken or plant-based alternatives, choosing fruit toast instead of muffins, and opting for dairy-free items could substantially cut household green gas emissions, according to a new Australian study. So researchers looked at the emissions for more than 25,000 everyday grocery items across Australian supermarkets like Aldi, Coles and Woolies. This is because food contributes up to 30% of global emissions.
Yeah, and they think that a household's climate pollution could essentially be reduced by 6 tonnes a year, which is roughly the equivalent to the emissions from an average Aussie household's grid-based electricity use, just by switching out a few of these items. So, for example, you could swap a kilo of beef mince with chicken each week to cut more than 2 tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions every year, while switching to a meat alternative would save 2.5 tonnes. So pretty interesting.
Yeah, and currently in Australia, there's no requirement for companies to include greenhouse gas emissions information on food labelling, which researchers are pushing for because the Consumer Policy Research Centre previously found that nearly half of Australians consider sustainability when deciding what to buy.
And in an Australian first, a politician has made headlines for joining OnlyFans. But no, you won't see any cheeky content from them. Instead, Brisbane Greens MP Stephen Bates says he's joined the platform to try and raise awareness about his party's HIV prevention drug policy.
Whoever says sex and politics doesn't mix hasn't heard what I've got for you, because I've got a huge policy announcement that'll top Labor and the LNP.
Yeah, the Greens want to introduce free PrEP and PEP, announced in his first video that he posted to the subscription site. And he's done this before on the dating app Grindr.
Yeah, and look, it's interesting to see more and more people, or people with kind of a platform, going on these types of sites to raise awareness for different issues. It's not the first time we've seen it. I believe there was a very lovely doctor who we love to interview doing the same.
Yeah, when we had Dr. Carl on the weekend briefing, he also mentioned using OnlyFans to help tackle climate change. And this was partly because of the platform's messaging design. So that app it's literally called Dr. Carl Says OnlyFans Can Save the Planet. And we'll pop that in the show notes and the other apps we mentioned earlier in the show as well.
Oh, look, who knew? OnlyFans to tackle HIV and climate. 2025 for you. Now, that brings our headlines to a close. Thank you so much, Helen, and thank you to you listening. Next up is my deep dive, looking at the ways political spin is being used this election campaign. And if you've heard the words Temu Trump and Mediscare, well, you've been the target. More on that coming up next. From Mediscare to Temu Trump, political spin is used by all sides of politics and really ramping up this election campaign. It's used to make you trust a leader, then to discredit them, to influence your vote at the ballot box, and even confuse you at times so you don't know what to believe. So if that's the case, how do we spot it? And how can you tell when what a politician says is actually true? Well, here to help us unpack that today is the University of Canberra's Caroline Fisher, who is a professor of political communication, a former journalist and media advisor for former Queensland Premier Anna Bligh. Needless to say, she is a political spin expert. Caroline, thank you so much for joining me on the briefing. Let's kick things off with what is political spin and how has it been used this election campaign?
Political spin, once upon a time, it was just about spinning words, about putting your best foot forward, about gilding the lily. And it's come to mean sort of everything now, from, really overt manipulative tactics through to outright lying. So it can mean a whole range of things, but we see different forms of it in every campaign, and we're certainly seeing different forms of it in this 2025 campaign.
Anything particular stand out?
Yes, in some ways. I actually think the level of spin being used this campaign is pretty mild. What we see when you compare to election campaigns in the US, for instance, with someone like Donald Trump, who lies all the time. You really can't rely on a single thing that comes out of his mouth. The degree of spin and lying that happens there compared to what's happening in this campaign in Australia is actually very mild. So when we just look at the campaign slogans, for instance, the ALP's got a fairly timid campaign about, building Australia's future. Okay, not very exciting. But then similarly, let's get Australia back on track by the Liberals. Again, we're not talking really inspiring or aspirational types of campaign slogans. However, we are seeing them borrow a whole bunch of stuff from the US. And so we have seen Make Australia Great Again start to feature in this campaign. We've seen the growing use of influencers and podcasting in this campaign, which we certainly saw being strongly used in the US campaign. And this isn't unusual, except that it's not having such a great impact. We're not America. And there is a bit of fear around Trump. And so the Conservatives adopting those sorts of slogans, it doesn't seem to be working that well for them at the moment.
Why do politicians use political spin, and is it effective?
Well, yes. Spin is an ancient technique. It used to once upon a time be called rhetoric. It's about the art of political persuasion. And there are a couple of elements to that. To be really effective in your spin, you need to kind of appeal to people's emotion, to their sense of credibility, to their sense of logic. And if you can combine those three components, then often you can come up with a really compelling argument. What we tend to see at the moment is a lot of appeal to emotion, fear, for instance, and we'll see that particularly in the political advertising as we get closer now to the pre-poll start and the closer to election day.
Now, you've previously written about overt and covert political spin tactics. What's the difference, and can you give me some examples of each of these?
So overt tactics are very standard and they're quite benign. So they're things like writing a press release or staging some kind of event, holding a press conference, giving a speech, just doing a regular media appearance. They're just overt, sort of public-facing, quite transparent presentation of political communication. But then there's what we call covert tactics, and they refer to a whole range of sort of cynical techniques to manage information. And a lot of the spin tactics that people refer to, and because spin has quite a dirty word, they tend to involve manipulation, obfuscation, sometimes outright lying. And they're the types of techniques that people sort of worry about.
While spin can be used to confuse another party's messaging, does it also not run the risk of confusing voters about a party's own policies? Like, one example I would want to give is during the leaders' debate, we saw both sides accusing the other of lying, manipulating narratives, scare campaigns, and disagreeing over timelines, and telling the audience the truth is right there in the budget papers, and they both said that. Like, is that not an example where people can't actually decipher who's telling the truth? And how is that beneficial for either side then?
No, it's a really good point. And unfortunately, because of spin and this kind of legacy now that we have of political lying. The public expects politicians to lie. And so trust in politicians has really fallen, as has trust in the media. And they're fairly linked, I have to say. So it is really hard. And when you start claiming one person is lying and the other person, that they're both lying, then, where do you go? All the audience can do is do their own research, which, of course, people don't necessarily. Some people will. Or we need a lot of fact-checking out there, fact-checking political claims. Again, very resource-intensive, but it's really necessary in the context of an election campaign. But you're right. I mean, it's very deflating. But what they're trying to do is say, I'm more trustworthy than he is. And yes, at the end of the day, the public thinks neither of them are particularly trustworthy. It's counterproductive.
Is there any particular example that stands out to you as like the most successful example of political spin being used during an election campaign?
So the classic campaign in Australia, I think that people refer to is historically as the Mediscare campaign. And that is a form of, negative political advertising where they claimed, of course, that the Conservatives, that the Liberal Party would cut Medicare. And there was very little evidence of that. There was a kernel of evidence there and that there was enough to fuel this fire. And so that proved to be very effective. And that's, the Mediscare campaign is kind of famous for that. And then, though, in 2019, the Morrison campaign sort of retaliated with its own scare campaign around taxes, taxing the ute and taxing the weekend and death taxes and a whole range of taxes. And again, there was no evidence for it. Kernel of a suggestion, which then gave them, the impetus to drum up this, this misleading campaign. And again, very effective. So it does, in Australia, we do have these sort of two examples over two sequential elections of pretty outright lying, to be honest. And that, of course, led to strong calls for truth in political advertising legislation. And, of course, we haven't achieved that in Australia. We have at state and territory level in certain parts of Australia, in the ACT and in South Australia, those laws exist. But we certainly haven't achieved it at federal level, even though the public would really like to see it.
Yeah, and we've even seen, the continuation of these Mediscare claims still in this federal election, so that's interesting. In this next part, I wanted to put a few examples to you if possible, and I'd like you to tell me whether you think these are examples of political spin or not. Recently, we saw an AEC investigation that was launched into a podcaster, Abby Chatfield, for her interview and social media posts with the Prime Minister. Now, the investigation came after the LNP raised it in Parliament, despite there being supposedly no evidence at that stage of kind of any dodgy doings. Is this an example of political spin?
Well, certainly a campaign tool, and what we're seeing is the use of influencers is growing. And we saw it in the US, of course, and, allowing influencers into the big debates and things. And in Australia, we had, influencers going into the lockup, the budget lockup, which is, normally the domain of just the press gallery and public servants. So this acknowledgement that influencers are obviously a really effective way to get to younger voters, particularly in this election when Gen Z is going to be, really represented. Is it a form of spin? Yes, so it is a tactic.
What about just the LNP raising it? I read that you had once written about like one tactic being feeding a story where a politician might keep an issue in the media by commenting on it. Would that be an example of that happening potentially?
Oh, absolutely. So that's right. Whether it's an election campaign or not, any little criticism, any weakness, any chink in the armour that you can find, absolutely you exacerbate it. That's right. So, you're trying to maximise the negative and minimise their positive. And so if you can find any weakness in their campaigning, you'll absolutely go for it. And both sides, are absolutely looking out for it. Some of them have dedicated units, so that they can dish dirt, dirt units, so that they can absolutely try to bring down their opponent. We saw that before the election with claims around Peter Dutton's financial investments, property holdings, etc., trying to sully perceptions about transparency, etc., about his own personal wealth and things like that. So this type of thing goes on all the time, and there are people dedicated to try and emphasise those weaknesses in their opponent.
And what about when Labor has likened Peter Dutton to Trump, saying things like Doji Dutton, Temu Trump, and saying he's copying US politics? Political spin? No political spin.
Oh, absolutely political spin. And it's working, it's effective. They're trying to create this association with what's happening in America. Now, for some very conservative people, that might seem like an attractive thing. And we see Advance Australia and the new Trumpet of Patriots party adopting all of these policies and the same slogans. And for a minority of people, that's going to seem to be very attractive. But actually, for most Australians, it's very unattractive, and particularly the Liberal voters. And we know that, and we can see it in the polling, that actually Liberal voters are quite scared of a Trumpian-style conservative politics in Australia. So it's deliberate that Labor is focusing on that, and it is to generate that fear and uncertainty about, do we want Trumpian-style politics in Australia? Don't vote for Dutton, because that's what you'll get. So, yeah, absolutely deliberate, an absolute form of spin.
Caroline, to finish off, what would you say is the most used political spin tactic in the playbook, and how would our listeners try and spot it to know when they're getting the truth?
I think the most common thing is, what I call truth but not the whole truth, selective truth. And it is hard to spot because they're only going to tell you the good bits, and they're going to deliberately leave out the bad bits. And it's very hard to get to underneath that. And like I say, it's really up to the audience, it's really up to voters to do their research, to read multiple sources, to try and get to the bottom of things. But just know, have your antenna up. Both the parties are only going to tell you what you want to hear. They're trying to get your vote. So take everything with a grain of salt and you'll be okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And some important advice as we're a few weeks out from the election. Caroline, thank you so much for joining me on the briefing.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for asking.
That was political spin expert Professor Caroline Fisher unpacking the world of spin and how we can spot it this election campaign. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. Before you go though, we would love it if you could share this ep with someone you think might find it interesting. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, and on TikTok and YouTube, search Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed with another ep this afternoon from 4. I'm Tara Cassidy. See you next time.